Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and my guest today is Sean De Vries, who is the Executive Director of the Battery Metals Association of Canada. And we're going to be talking about a recently released report titled From Rocks to Power: Strategies to Unlock Canada's Critical Minerals for Global Leadership in Energy Storage, EVs, and Beyond. So, welcome to the interview, Sean.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I want to tell you a little story to set up our interview. 3, 4 years ago, I was interviewing the head of Bloomberg NEF's mining and metals division, and we were talking about exactly this topic. How do you build a battery supply chain in Canada? Because, of course, I think at that time Bloomberg was considered Canada the number one country for potential development. And I asked him, I said, well, how long do we have? I mean, surely we've got a decade, right? I mean, maybe we've got at least to 2030. He said, no. He said, you've got 2 to 5 years because in this space, China absolutely dominates. I mean, you can look at not just the mining, but the smelting, all the processing to make battery metals and then into cells and then into packs. China dominates. So if North America wants an industry, well, everybody wants in on this action. He says you have 2 to 5 years, and Canada really needs to get its act together. So when I saw your report, that's the first thing I thought of is, yay, maybe we're making some progress here. So you want to give us just a little bit of an overview of the report and where we're at now, and by we, I mean Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a good starting point because really we do see this as such a massive opportunity in Canada. It goes back to the critical minerals that we keep hearing about and talking about. It's in the news everywhere. But what our point is that it's beyond the critical minerals. It's those next steps. It's the materials processing. It's the production of batteries and really other clean technologies as well. So there's so much opportunities that can come out of that. What's happened in the recent history is China really has taken the lead on both processing those critical minerals, but also developing the clean technologies. For us, the risk really is, having our own clean economy, energy security as well within Canada. So that's why we want to take this on and ensure that we can be able to do this, not just the mineral processing or pardon me, the extraction, but the processing and those other steps within Canada as well. So that's really what we've done here is try to map out what are these opportunities. So beyond just the minerals themselves, how do we now put that into action and start to develop these industries?
There's some background here that's required, and that is the work that the Biden administration started in 2021. Because I remember reading speeches, and I bring this up often during my interviews. Uh, there's a speech that was given by Gina Raimondo, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, and she said during the first year of the pandemic, the United States realized it could not be dependent on supply chains in critical areas from China. It just couldn't. It was China was becoming too much of a geopolitical rival, maybe even a military rival at some point, and you just can't have your rival controlling all of the access to key parts of your economy and your war machine, your military. And so they put in place the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, there was hundreds of billions of dollars available. President Donald Trump is scaling that back, but he can't stop it. And there is going to be a battery industry in North America. There are a number of plants existing and planned and in construction already. And that's really kind of the market here, right? We're thinking North America industry. Some of those plants will be in Canada, a lot will be in the US, but we would like to supply all of the minerals and the metals. Have I got that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the processing of those, right? Right now, we don't have enough of that capacity in Canada. If we extract things, they would need to be exported to be processed somewhere else. Then you'd really lose the ability to build out the rest of that value chain. So we see this as the opportunity to develop the processing here, potentially some other steps. But of course, there are opportunities to export some of those higher value materials than once they've been processed into battery grade other clean technologies again, like rare earths into magnets and things like that. So it goes beyond just the batteries themselves and really into applications like defense, as you indicated, which is really key right now. A lot of governments are looking at medical as well, just our general electronics. So the scope is very wide, and that's why it creates a huge opportunity when we add in kind of that export market as well. So great opportunities. When we talk about minerals, we see that largely coming from the north in Canada. So not just, the provinces, but in the territories. And of course, now we're talking about ports and, export and avenues to international markets. So we start to see how this creates massive opportunities, even beyond just those minerals now, for other things like the transport and export of those materials.
Here at Energy Media, we kicked off a campaign we call Canada 2050. This is a couple of months ago, and basically getting people excited about an idea, an economic strategy. One, and now that we have Prime Minister Mark Carney, the economist from Oxford. But here's the point of it. There are three parts to the strategy, and the first one is add value to natural resources. Don't ship out raw material. The second is electrify everything, because that's the direction the global economy is going. If we want to be competitive, that's what we have to do. And the third is build all the infrastructure to support one and two. So ports and our power grids and our labor force, all of that needs attention if it has to be part of the strategy. And I was really pleased to see that general approach is kind of baked into your report.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because again, it's more than those minerals. How do we get them out and where do they go to? So when we talk about the North in particular, there are some challenges there that we've got to overcome, whether it's electricity and getting that to those sites to be able to get the minerals out, or it's the transport. How do we now, actually move those to market? So those are two key areas that we really looked at. We know that we've got to develop a broader stretch of our green energy across the country. Transport infrastructure, whether it's roads and rails and ports, that's going to be another big piece of it. So we really do see that as key to kind of building onto those resources. And that's really what we tried to map out. So when you start off with what each region has to offer, you start to look at how this picture comes together, and we can really specialize and leverage what each region has as advantages, whether it's those critical minerals from the start or access to markets and things like that. So that's really what we tried to identify, and kind of how we can jumpstart some of these projects by building on those regional advantages and the specifics that they have to offer.
Did your report do any employment forecasting? If we do the mining, we'll have X jobs. If we do the smelting and refining, we'll have X more jobs, those sorts of things.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that in the report. High level, when we look at it kind of on the side. Building out a hub like this, you could look at 100,000 potential jobs, right across the sector. So there's a massive potential impact. What we really do see, though, is skills development and the need for workers, because this is another piece to it that we recognized as a barrier. When we're talking about remote areas for mining and things like that, we're talking about highly skilled labor force required for materials production. Like, these are some of the things that we have to be adding into these considerations and building on as well.
Yeah, if you're going to compete with China, you really have to put some effort into it, because they've had an electronics manufacturing industry for a long time. And I've had any number of guests come on here and say one of their biggest competitive advantages, and I mean China, is the fact that they have supply chains already set up that can pivot and support this kind of manufacturing. And whereas we don't, or not, our supply chains aren't as robust, we have to put more effort into it. And that means that government has to play a bigger role. And so when you did this report, you consulted widely within the industry and government and so on. What's the sense of how fast this is going, and will governments at both the federal level and provincial levels be able to put in place the policy framework, regulatory framework to make it work?
It's going very fast. It needs to go faster, I think, is really, the bottom line. How fast can we make that? Well, we've seen some bills developing in Ontario, BC, federally. And I think governments are looking at that. They're trying to figure out ways we can speed this up. What we have to recognize, though, is some of the inherent challenges with that, and rights holders as well, and how they're part of this discussion and these developments. So what we don't want to do is get too fast ahead of ourselves, that we're not meeting the rights of rights holders, the communities that we're going to be dealing with. So that's an important part of it. But yeah, we're working on the policy now. We need to be doing a lot of these things in parallel. So part of what that means is, in the meantime, as we're building out things like battery factories or processing facilities, we may need to rely on external markets for a period of time. So importing materials to support those production facilities. Likewise, if we are mining, we may need to be exporting some of that material to other markets for processing or stockpiling or looking at things like that. So there's creative ways that we have to look at this in order to be able to develop so many things in parallel, because the real challenge here is there's so much to develop at once.
Yes, and Prime Minister Carney has talked about industrial policy. And this is one of those kind of vague, nerdy terms that we hear a lot and don't put a lot of thought into. But here at Energy Media, we've interviewed like Bentley Allen from the Transition Accelerator and experts like that. And it's very clear that the modern version of industrial policy is get stakeholders together, form like almost a hub, where everybody brings something, could be local governments, indigenous groups, labor, on, work out your strategy, work out a plan to implement the strategy. Then everybody who has a piece of that strategy goes and begins to implement it. And you build, and the idea is to build supply chains for global industries. So it's very consistent with this. And Prime Minister Carney has been talking about kind of this approach. Do you see that's kind of approach to industrial policy as being a key part of developing out a battery metals industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that the Transition Accelerator is our partners on this report. And so we're very much taking that approach. We do see the necessity to get other groups involved. And in part of that, sometimes what happens is we look to government, whether it's policy, whether it's investment to help support these developments. But we really do need to go beyond that. We need industry support, community support, as you said, all the way into research and development. So some of these things that we need to be having kind of as part of these discussions to know what's happening in the future, where we should be looking to in the future. So this is why that broad industry or stakeholder part of me approach is really necessary. And I think that as we move forward, that's going to help us to basically de-risk some of these projects. This is the biggest challenge that we have right now. How do we get extra funds in? How do we get things moving and support for these projects? So showing that there's broad support for them, showing that we've got not just industry at the table, but government and other groups as well. Then we help to get further some of that other investment and get other support for the projects.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. In China, government led. In the United States under Biden, it was more of a collaborative approach, the kind of that you're describing. And clearly, we've got to pick an approach and get on with it. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and this has kind of come up, in the last 2 or 3 months. I've interviewed a couple of folks who are engineers. They've got business models around integrating these kinds of new technologies. So this fellow down in Costa Rica, for example, he goes to, their grid isn't very reliable. So he goes to like an ice cream factory. And he said, look, you need to be running 24/7. You need cheaper power. We're going to come with a package that has solar power, controls, storage, whatever else they need. And it's the integration that is the value here. China is, I think it's almost inevitable. China is just going to build a whole lot of pieces of this puzzle cheap.
Yeah.
But it's adding value and more research and more science and more integration and more ways to have the economy adopt these kinds of technologies. And I wonder if that was discussed in the writing of the report.
I think that's part of it at the broad scale of just trying to build out an entire ecosystem, right? Like it's not about just picking one segment that we think that we can lead in, because we know critical minerals, for instance, we can lead in that. But it's all the way through that battery life cycle until recycling at the end. How do we get those batteries back? How do we recycle them, recover the materials, and make that the material for the next generation of batteries? So absolutely, I think that integration right across the industry is key. And that's going to help us build out those other pieces for sure.
Your report calls for a deep dive on 8 EV critical materials, and I'll just list them here quickly. Copper, graphite, iron, lithium, nickel, phosphate, rare earth elements, and vanadium. That's a fair list, but that is not an exhaustive list. I mean, this industry needs more than just those 8 critical minerals. What's the strategy to fill in the gaps where Canada doesn't have an industry that can produce those minerals?
Yeah, I think that is a good question, and you can only start with so many at the beginning. Canada has 34 critical minerals on the list. We've taken a small selection of that, and there's even more. So I think this kind of work and this kind of analysis needs to happen on a broader scale to see really what are the opportunities. We can't pick everything and be winners in everything. We can't lead in everything. So where do we want to focus that we get the biggest bang for the buck? That multiplier effect is one of those things that I think is the biggest impact here. So instead of making an investment into one, whether it's a process, a facility, something like that, how is that going to have impacts on others? And that's what we need to start to look at to say, if you're processing a material, do we have the other pieces of the value chain that can feed into that? So the materials coming in, the downstream customers that can take that material. That then has a bigger impact, and we start to be able to direct investments to the place where you're going to have the most impact with it.
Let's talk about the workforce for a bit here, because what I hear from a lot of folks who are in their 20s and say up to 35 is we just don't have the job opportunities anymore that maybe the generations ahead of us had, and we're frustrated about that. And this seems to be a perfect opportunity to as we build out the workforce, get them educated and trained and experienced so they can add value to the industry, is to target those groups. So they might be kids that are in school now might become an engineer, they might become a technologist, they might become an operator. I mean, who knows? But targeting that younger age cohort that's having trouble in the workforce now, was that part of the report?
This isn't part of this stage yet, but this is definitely one of those gaps that we see as going forward. How do we fill all these positions now? And when we hear these challenges, right, people are looking for these types of roles. But what we're talking about is entirely new roles in some cases that haven't been there before. We haven't previously had these. So now we're trying to get kids to think about mining differently, materials processing, which they may not have been thinking about. So what are the skills that they need? What are the training, the courses that they need to get into these types of things? Because it's just an entirely new market for them as they approach this. So I think that's one of the things that we have to do and to focus on going forward.
I know a young woman who's about mid 30s, and she's an engineer, and she's a process engineer. And so we've discussed this issue, and she says, look, I may not have experience in, processing critical minerals and turning them into battery metals, but it's a process. And I can be trained very quickly on how to do the process that's required. And one of the advantages I think that Canada has, and particularly Alberta has this, is more engineers per capita than just about any place on the planet, except for maybe the U.S. and China. And that seems to be a strategic strength, is that we don't need to have people who have done it. We need people who have done it, who can train the really smart, experienced, and well-trained people we already have.
Yeah, that's exactly it. A lot of these skills are going to be transferable across different sectors. We see oil and gas, for instance. There's a lot of people that have come out of that are already in this field now of we see that in the lithium brine space. There's a close crossover to the oil and gas, but that can be transferable. So those are the kinds of things that we want to see. In fact, as part of this work, we looked at the regional hubs to say what is the ideal processes for different regions. That's precisely why we think that Edmonton Calgary corridor really is a prime location to do some of this materials processing. We've got the skill sets there. We've already got a lot of the assets there. So when we start to leverage that kind of stuff, that's what'll jumpstart the developments for us.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Sean. What kind of a timeline are we talking about? Are we starting at the beginning? Have we already made some progress? Are we midway through? Where are we at with this? And look out for over the next 5 or 10 years and tell us what you think will happen. We won't hold you to it, but I know my viewers will be curious.
Well, I would say that we're in process, which is good. We're not at the starting point, although we're still pretty early in the stage. What's positive, though, and if you look at the report in detail, you can start to see that a lot of these developments are already underway. And so they're at different stages. We've now got to focus on which can we get across the finish line to actually start production or processing. So that's a little bit of the next stage now, trying to prioritize and figure out where things are at. We really do need to start to see some things moving. I mean, frankly, we do already have some battery production in Canada, whether it's, E1 Moly that's been doing it for years. Stellantis, we know, has started a facility. So there are things happening that we can't forget about. We just need to add these other pieces to it. So it's going to be a bit of a continual process. but we need a real focused effort to get there now.
Sean, we'll look forward to having you back because I think this is a key part of Canada's economic future. And we have heard the Prime Minister Carney say at the federal level that it is build, 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 and not tomorrow, it's today. Things have to move quickly. So this seems to be a timely report that I'm sure the government will be very interested in. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.